Welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And today we're doing a show we haven't done. I don't think we've done anything on the world of comic books per se that were actually about comic books. This is a very fan-based one. We're going to do it on this particular comic here, The Watchmen by Alan Moore. And specifically, we're going to discuss our thoughts and opinions about the comic novel. And then we're going to also look at the 2009 film adaptation by Zack Snyder, and then the 2019 HBO limited series by Damon Lindelof. And we're going to share our feelings and our opinions about how this work, what we feel about it, how we feel about both an adaptation and sequelization. And if you've never read The Watchmen or seen the movie or watched the TV show, do yourself a favor and miss this episode because we are going to go so deep into spoilers, it will almost seem pointless. It also means, this is one of those episodes, right, Randall, where if you haven't really read the graphic novel, or seen at least the movie or the TV show, you're going to get kind of lost.
Well, I think that all our episodes should have a spoiler alert. I mean, we don't do reviews. We do in-depth discussions of these things.
Right, but sometimes we'll discuss something where anyone can watch. I mean,
well, anybody can watch, but we'll definitely spoil it.
Not every no, because when we did Network, we did at least warn people when, hey, this is when you want to get off the train. Here, we're not going to even bother. Just get off the train. That said, if you like our show and you do want to watch other episodes and you think we're doing interesting stuff, please like and subscribe to our show. And if you've got an opinion about anything we've said, please, whether you like what we're doing, you hate what we're doing, you're confused what we're doing, whatever you say, please leave a comment so we can read it and we can absolutely respond. Right, Randall?
That's right. That's right. We love your comments. So comment.
And where can people comment?
Well, they could go to our website, chrisandrandall.com, and leave a comment there, or they could go to our Facebook page, Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall. It's on Facebook. Those are two good places. I mean, you could email me. The email's on the page. Yeah.
All right, so you got a lot of options, and that's great because we got a lot of opinions. Sometimes we're brilliant, and sometimes we're dumb. So I want us to be complimented when we are one or the other. So this is The Watchmen. Actually, just to be very clear, this is a collection of all the issues of the miniseries of comics. In 1986, I started reading the comic. I think I started in the third issue. I actually own every real issue of it, but there's no way in hell I'm going to dig out all of my old Watchmens for this show. Not that I don't enjoy your company. I just don't really want to have to go through all my boxes. So yeah, I guess here once again, you would have been in 1986. How old? You were 10.
Yeah, about 11. Hey, Chris.
11.
So in '86, The Watchmen comes out, and you were a big comic book fan at the time. Can you describe?
So I'm So
what the environment was like, what it was like when it came out? Because it had a huge effect, right, in the comic book world, right?
Yeah, it was. I was 21. I was in college. I'll be honest with you. I was getting to the point where I was still reading comics, and there were great comics. I mean, the mid '80s, early to mid '80s, both at Marvel and DC, you had a lot of great writers coming into the comic book world, writing great stuff. And I was still reading it. And thankfully, it was just in the right time where a 20-something could read comics and it would be cool. However, I certainly wasn't reading as many comics because I was busy studying. And I was taking so many classes in English that I was becoming far more critical of the kind of comics that I was reading. But this was great because it was at its premise characters that are very much like the characters that I had read in DC with a very DC comic sensibility. And to be really clear, and I think it's important to understand, Marvel characters, I always feel, are grounded in the real world. They are people like us who just are cursed or blessed with an extraordinary ability. Wouldn't you say, Randall?
Well, you know more about the subject than me. I mean, you've been telling me
Well,
about
like
this over the years. You should just
Spider-Man
talk
is
about it.
right? But Spider-Man's every teenager, wouldn't you say?
Uh, no, I would. Peter
Dude,
Parker, he's a super
seriously.
genius.
No,
He's a
but
smart guy.
you get my point that Marvel heroes tend to be grounded more in our world. They live in New York City, and they have rough edges.
Right.
Whereas
You would say that.
Superman is a god, right?
Right. You would say that DC is about gods and Marvel is about extraordinary humans, right?
Right. And they're extraordinary humans who live in a metropolis or a Gotham. So in some sense, they don't have any real connection with our own world. Whereas you now had these very godlike, not all of them godlike, but you really had all of these iconic style superheroes in a world that was very much like the 1986 that I was living in, albeit, through the looking glass of an alternative history.
Yeah,
And
when you told me that theory years ago, I thought that I've always been looking for flaws, but it's pretty solid. I've
yeah,
noticed.
so it's just it was a mind fuck. It was like, whoa, you're never going to make DC superheroes Marvel, but this is even better because you're taking these iconic style heroes and you're exposing them in a way that's even far more humanistic than any Marvel comic book in its time. And you're setting it in our world, albeit one where Nixon is president, and then we won the Vietnam War. But it's more our world than what I had seen in any comic book beforehand. So that was the perfect catnip, a 20-year-old Chris Corbell reading a 20-year-old comic, a comic for adults, essentially. And it had a traditional, I'm going to show you the pages, if you can see, a beautiful painting, but it's done like a comic book. But then inside you have fake articles by the characters. You have all sorts of additional information. You have a subplot about a pirate story. You have the Black Hood, a biography. Sorry, you can't see it from here, but it's all sorts of secondary source material, beautiful painting work. But again, the artwork by Dave Gibbons, only 5 colors he's working with, a very traditional comic paneling, exciting stuff. So,
Well,
and
could
it
I
was
just
something
say
that
it's
it was something I could talk to my fellow students, my fellow college classmates about, and have intelligent conversations. Go on.
well, I just want
Go
to
ahead. I
say
didn't mean to interrupt.
the mastermind behind the comic was Alan Moore, right? And he was a writer. He didn't do any illustrations, right? And so he had.
It was a collaboration between Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, and even more, it says that was an equal collaboration between the two.
Okay.
Moore's idea, but once he brought Gibbons in, he made him a collaborator on the project. And then executive editor Len Wein also oversaw the project. Len said that he basically wanted to give Moore as much distance as possible. Len Wein created Wolverine and the new X-Men, by the way, over at Marvel. He's one of the great comic writers in his own right. But yes, go on about Alan Moore.
No, you covered it.
Alan Moore, I'm not giving him his due, and he is essential because Alan Moore is from England. He was already writing deconstruction. There was a comic book in England called Miracle Man. He took it over. It was kind of another Superman-esque.
Well, I guess I just want to say
completely deconstructed him.
I guess I just want to say that, yes, all 3 of these gentlemen contributed greatly to the final product, but it was Alan Moore's original idea. And I think I read somewhere that Alan Moore had always wanted to make work on a comic book that would end, right? He wanted to tell like a story that would just completely end.
Yeah.
And it would completely explore the comic book medium, both aesthetically and philosophically. And he accomplished that, right?
Well, there's a great quote by Alan Moore. I actually wrote it down. I'm going to see if I can do this. Yeah. And I wrote it down because it sums up what he was thinking when he wrote The Watchmen. He said, he was being interviewed. He said he was writing The Watchmen to not be anti-American, but anti-Reaganism, specifically believing that at the moment, a certain part of Reagan's America isn't scared. They think they're invulnerable.
Could I just say, I think like all really great works of art, this work got away from the artist. I know that Moore may have had such intentions.
No, I don't want to just stop you there, but no, that's just factually not true. They really did collaborate on this.
Well, that's not what I mean at all, Chris. I mean,
what do you mean?
He may have intended to prove those themes or prove certain concepts in his work or educate the public in his work. But I think that the work is, it goes beyond simplistic. It goes beyond like a simplistic analysis that even Moore had in his brain when he started, because for instance, the character of Rorschach is like, is perhaps not the kind of character that Moore would endorse as heroic, and Rorschach is supposed to be more of a character that is supposed to be something we're not supposed to want.
Well,
but he's become like an anti-hero, he's beloved.
Let's at least, before we get into the story, let's just finish up on Moore and Gibbons, just so that we can explain a little bit about the story. So no, I mean, he literally would talk, and he would drive 50 miles in a cab to give the artwork to Gibbons, and they would talk about how to plot this thing. Now, this is interesting because I just told you what Moore said was the inspiration, but what Gibbons said slightly contradicts Moore, because Gibbons stated there's no overt political message at all. It's a fantasy exploration of what might happen if people can see things in it that apply to real America, and then they're reading into the comic. While Moore wanted to write about power politics and the warring times he lived in, he stated that the reason the story was set in an alternative reality was because he was worried that the reader would switch off if he attacked a leader they admired. Moore stated in 1986 he was conclusively trying to do something that would make people feel uneasy. So Gibbons is, in the same way that you might say Engels to Marx, Gibbons is not the originator, but it's a pretty solid collaboration. But hey, just before we get into what you are going to say, let's take a few moments just to give the overall synopsis of the story. So in this comic book universe, superheroes are introduced in 1938. There's a hero named Hooded Justice. Hooded Justice is like a Batman. Then in 1940, there's like a Justice Society called the Minutemen. It's led by Captain Midnight. It introduces Silk Spectre, the Comedian, the Night Owl, the Veil, and they're a parody of a Justice League or a Justice Society. Then in 1960, the first truly superhuman being is made, which is Dr. Manhattan. John Osterman has radioactive, which is very Marvel-esque. He's exposed to radiation, and he becomes a godlike being. He and the Comedian help fight in Vietnam, but because he's such a godlike being, he wins the war. The Comedian, working for Richard Nixon, assassinates Woodward and Bernstein. Nixon becomes so popular for winning the Vietnam War that they repeal the amendment that limits the presidential term. So it's now 1985. Oh, then in 1977, sorry, I got to do this. Congress passes legislation that outlaws superheroes except for those who work for the government, which means the Comedian and Dr. Manhattan. Then and I'm completely forgetting Ozymandias. My bad. Ozymandias joined in, when was he? Ozymandias, I think, comes in with the other superhero team. They form in the 60s. But Ozymandias, Night Owl 2, and Silk Spectre, they're the superheroes along with Rorschach. They're all disbanded in 77. with the Keene Act, all that is left is Dr. Manhattan and the comedian who worked for the government. And we open up, it's 1985. Richard Nixon is still president. The comedian has just been murdered. And Rorschach has become basically his own vigilante private eye, investigates the murders. Take it from there.
Okay, well, do you think that was a novel concept that Alan Moore was introducing in Watchmen, where basically these superheroes are just vigilantes that put on a mask and run wild in the streets? I mean, was that?
Well, that's certainly what you can see with Rorschach, right? Rorschach is holding up Batman to a different light, right? He says that morality is subjective. He's very hypocritical.
Well, the difference
in who he goes after.
Right.
Yeah.
What the difference with Batman, the Batman comic and Watchmen is Batman starts as a detective, right? And he works with the police. I mean, he's sort of like a private investigator. I mean,
yeah.
He was invented in the era of private investigator novels, right? Pulp Fiction novels of PIs.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, he's kind of like a super private investigator. I mean,
but he works well. Batman is known as the world's greatest detective.
Right.
And it's true that he is, depending on who is writing him, he is either driven for vengeance or he is driven for justice. And weirdly enough, around the same time that Alan Moore is writing this, Frank Miller comes up with The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One. And I would argue that Frank Miller, this is a whole other episode, separates what had been established by the late Denny O'Neil. Instead of making him a hero who's about justice, Batman becomes a hero driven by vengeance, which weirdly enough, I would agree with you. Rorschach is driven by vengeance.
Really? I would say Rorschach isn't driven by vengeance. I think he was driven by just like an obsession with law and order, with right and wrong. Not even law and order, right and wrong, I think.
Well, they cite in his files, he talks about the murder of Kitty Genovese, which is a real murder,
right,
where this woman was murdered and 19 people overheard her being attacked and did nothing. So, and he was abused as a child, which is an interesting origin story. I've never really seen that as an origin story. So he has been a victim. He has empathy for victims, and he has rage for those who, but not evenly so. I mean, we will find out as the story unfolds, he's very selective about that. And at the same time, he's a sadist.
Well, it's interesting. Like his name, you could interpret his actions in many various different ways. I mean, he's an enigmatic character. And he's committed. He is, I would argue, you could almost argue, in a sense, he is the protagonist of the graphic novel because he is committed to solving the mystery of who killed the comedian. And bringing that person to justice. Well,
and that's that's like the most traditional superhero goal in all of superheroes, right? The most basic superhero is like, I'm going to solve this crime. I'm going to bring the villain to justice. And in this point in the story, Night Owl 2 is another element, I would argue, of Batman, because he's also an ordinary man, but like Batman in the 50s and 40s, and even actually Batman Forever, you see, not the movie, sorry, he's good at making props. You know, he has Archie, which is his flying car. He has all sorts of technology. So while he was a superhero in the 60s and 70s, after replacing the original Night Owl, he represents, I would almost argue, that Batman from that era, the one who is more about gadgetry to go after people. Now, mind you, in this point in history, he's retired. He's in his 40s, and he's moved to the suburbs, and he's gotten fat, and he's checked out of the super. He wants a comfortable and simple life. He considers superheroism silly. I do feel like on some level it's almost a commentary that Moore and Gibbons are making on what superheroes were like after passing. What was that? There was that famous thing, Seduction of Innocence, in the 53.
When the comic book
Ba-
code was implemented, when the ban was implemented?
Absolutely. So after the comic book code was implemented, Superman and Batman, which had been about social realism, the Ku Klux Klan was first discussed in Superman because one of the writers for the Superman in the 1940s had been an investigative journalist, and he had wanted to write an article on the Ku Klux Klan, and they wouldn't let him. So he did a whole series, right? You know more about this than I do.
Well, there are articles online. If you Google like Superman and the KKK, there is an argument that historians have made that Superman destroyed the KKK.
Right. Well, people were learning about the KKK for the first time in the pages of Superman. And Bob Kane grew up poor. When he created Batman, he wanted to know what rich people were like. I know this because my mom interviewed Bob Kane. And that's what she learned from Bob Kane. So there has always been a class struggle in the old Batman. Batman and Superman in the 40s really fought evil capitalists before they started to fight the Joker. And, Lex Luthor is, after all, at heart, an evil capitalist. So socioeconomics, but that got wiped away for the sillier stories. And I feel like Night Owl is a product of, it's a satirization it's a satire on that. And by the 1980s, not only has he come up to his senses that it's absurd, but he's come fat, prosperous, and uninterested. And Ozymandias, who also is a kind of a Batman or a Superman because he has high intelligence and can also create gadgets, he builds a fortune on consumer items, including making toy versions of Ozymandias, the ultimate conceit.
Yeah, he merchandises himself, right?
He retires from being an active superhero to cash in on being a superhero. I mean, in that sense, it was like Batman from the 60s, and Bruce Wayne decided, hey, I'm Bruce Wayne already. Why, it's basically if Batman gave up being Batman to continue being Bruce Wayne.
Yeah, so Alan Moore and Gibbons and the editor, Watchmen introduced many elements, right, that comic books started using almost immediately, right, because they were so genius, right? It was like
absolutely
the mass vigilante thing.
And Ozymandias, you're really starting to see, like, did you ever read Iron Man in that period?
No, not me.
Well, again, you can see in a positive manner how someone can use their vast fortunes to fight crime. And you see that also Ozymandias is brilliant, which is not true of Rorschach, and it's not even true of Dan Freiberg, the Night Owl, too. Ozymandias is brilliant, and Batman becomes brilliant again. And brilliant in a way that you start seeing, even to this day, where Batman comes up with these very disgusting counter strategies on how he could take down every single superhero just in case he has to.
He becomes very Ozymandias-like.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I honestly think that if you've been familiar with Batman from the last 15 years, you can see a lot of Ozymandias behind the scenes, ends justifying the means qualities in the way that we conceive Batman. And let's get through the rest. I do want to hit them all. Silk Spectre is, to me, one of the most fascinating and not particularly well. She's a little underwritten, but in this, I'd like to know more, is that she's the daughter of a superhero. She doesn't have powers per se, but she was trained by her mom, who's the original Silk Spectre, to be a good fighter. And she ends up going out with Dr. Manhattan. She leaves Dr. Manhattan for Night Owl. She discovers that the comedian raped her mother and is her father. And in doing so, shows Dr. Manhattan what it's like to be a human being. I mean, she's, in a way, the most complicated character. And I honestly, do you even see in Silk Spectre a similarity between her and some other comic book hero?
Silk Spectre is interesting to me because, I remember I read Watchmen many years after it came out, but And when you read it, you see how comic book writers have stolen from Watchmen ever since it came out. But yeah, Silk Spectre is unique because um, I guess you could argue, I've never seen very much analysis of Silk Spectre, but I guess you could argue she's kind of a negative depiction of a woman. I mean, you could even argue, I could see an argument made that it's misogynistic, her character.
I
I've
see
never
kind of
seen that
the.
argument, though.
I mean, there's probably someone's going to make that argument, but I see really the opposite. I mean, her mom is a little bit like the original Black Canary who fought crime while wearing fishnet stockings. And if you look at the drawing of Silk Spectre, Dave Gibbons, by the way, is the one who came up with all of the costumes. Moore said, you design them as you see fit. They wanted to do the Charlton comics, but DC would not allow them. So they used that as a building block, but then they got to do whatever they wanted. And Gibbons built her, at least her mom, to be like Black Canary. And Black Canary, by the way, side note, in the DC universe, the Black Canary of World War II is the mother of the Black Canary of today, albeit it's been very retrofitted. There's a character named Zatanna, who is a daughter of a magician superhero named Zentara, but in some sense, you could argue the closest thing that really she resembles is a sidekick.
Okay, well, let me just say, her depiction, her character is very nuanced, detailed, a flawed female character. Okay, and
yeah,
most comic books don't have female characters like that. So Alan Moore is blazing new territory there that
Moore and Gibbons are, yeah,
that no one has bothered to go into. No other comic book writers have bothered to go down that path. And another thing I wanted to say was she okay, I forgot what I was going to say. Go ahead.
Oh, her storyline is the storyline that unites all the other characters in the story, because she is romantically involved with Dr. Manhattan.
Oh, that's what I wanted to say. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Her character is very much, her sexuality as a woman, okay, is very much a part of her character. It's a major element of the story, like you just said. And and it's interesting because Alan Moore would go on, I think, with his wife to publish a comic book of erotica, female, mostly aimed at women. And I
did not know that
one. That came out that's like the last thing he worked on, I think. That came out 5-6 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. But anyway, so you can see, female sexuality is something that Alan Moore is thinking about, is in his head, and the Silk Spectre character, yeah, I mean, she's it's very layered, it's very complex. I mean, it's more thought goes into her character, like you're saying. More thought probably goes into her character than almost any other character in the book.
Yeah, and she's involved with Night Owl too. At the end, really, they're the most hopeful part of the ending. I want to get to that in a moment. And her mother was raped by the comedian. So Night Owl 1 was raped. And the Rorschach knew this, but Rorschach didn't think it was worth taking care of. Rorschach said, well, that's not a crime that I need to prosecute. Even though Rorschach certainly could have stopped the comedian, he and him are at equal power levels. It proves that on some level, Rorschach is a giant hypocrite.
Well,
so
that
every character, his lives is touched upon somehow, and it shapes. She's more shaped, I would argue. Her mind is, her psychology, her mentality is more shaped by the experiences of having grown up and having been and being influenced by superheroes than any other character in the story.
Yeah, that could be Rorschach's one major flaw. I mean, why would he not care about that particular crime? I don't know.
Well, but it's a point that Moore's really trying to make, that, and you see it in other parts of Rorschach, that Rorschach isn't really Batman, in that he doesn't hold steadfast to his views. He only holds steadfast to his views inconsistently when it works for him. So later on, that will actually show that he's not. That said, he is willing to die for a cause. he's willing to die. So
Well-
it's even more confusing that
Well,
way.
yeah.
So we
Well,
have to get to Dr. Manhattan now because, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say Rorschach is is only beholden to his own internal code. He's almost like a Western gunslinger, and so
But his
he
internal code lacks consistency.
well, whatever. Nobody knows what it is. Actually, I don't think. I think you have to, as a reader, you have to interpret his code. I mean, maybe there is consistency, maybe there isn't. I don't know if you can definitively come
Oh,
down on one side or the
I
other.
think though, to me, I think it's the whole point is that he's no hero. That in fact, he's just pure chaos. But that's just my take. But let's get to Dr. Manhattan because Dr. Manhattan, I would argue, is the most significant character. Even if he is one of the most opaquely written, he's still the most because he's Superman. If Superman had a Marvel origin story, right?
He's all
In fact,
powerful.
well, first off, he starts off as a European Jew named John Osterman who comes to New York City. And you could honestly say that that's paying homage to the generation of Jewish writers who lived in New York City who wrote the Jerry Siegel, the Joe Schusters, the Kirbys, the Lees, who were responsible for the golden age of superheroes. And in turn, they were writing these Ubermen as a fantasy of who they'd like to be. Again, Kane, Lee, these were young Jewish New York boys who wished they were the Shadow and Doc Savage. So he has that origin story, and then he, in a very Marvel Silver Age way, he's a scientist who gets exposed to a certain kind of radiation, and then he gets these godlike powers. But I would argue there's no one in the Marvel universe, not even the Hulk, whereas Dr. Manhattan, as in the Manhattan Project, he's even stronger. I mean, I know I haven't read them. Have you read any of the Superman Dr. Manhattan crossovers that have recently
Oh, I
come
didn't
out?
even know there were any.
Oh yeah, DC now finally just they cashed in hard on that boat. But he's the most superior being in the world, and I feel like the way that Moore and Gibbons deal with him is almost a god among men, but not a god with almost no feelings.
Well, he's a great character because it's his very powers that make him detached from the rest of humanity. And it's an internal
Yeah.
mental struggle Dr. Manhattan has to find the will to use his powers to help humanity. Because why does he care? He's an immortal, all-powerful being. Why would he care about the ants crawling around
And
planet Earth?
but originally that's how he starts out. He becomes Dr. Manhattan. He works for the government. He works on a superhero team. He ends the Vietnam War up to pretty much around the end of the story. Dr. Manhattan he's got some involvement with humanity. But now let's get to the ending, and we're going to jump a lot of the story. The culmination of the story is that Ozymandias was responsible for the death of the comedian. Rorschach, Night Owl, and Silk Spectre 2 go to the equivalent of the Fortress of Solitude, where they find this out, but they find this out too late as he has dropped a giant psychic squid killing half of New York City with 3 million dead. The only reason he was able to somehow trick using tachyon particles, confuse Dr. Manhattan so that he would not be able to come in time to save them. But he has been able to finally show up. And in what is a traditional, you think would be a traditional denouement, Dr. Manhattan saves the day and the team saves the world from Ozymandias. Ozymandias basically says, don't the ends justify the means? At which point, Silk Spectre and Blue Beetle, Night Owl 2, they're done. Like, okay, well, there's really no point in caring. This is beyond our pay grade. Let's just deal with what we can deal with, and that's it. And then, there's a scene between Night Owl 2 and Rorschach where basically Night Owl says, look, dude, there's nothing we can do. Just accept that you're not able to change everything and move on. And Rorschach accuses him of compromising too easily, which he's more than happy to do. And then the Rorschach takes off into the snow, and then Dr. Manhattan and Ozymandias have a discussion about how important this is. So Dr. Manhattan comes to Rorschach and says, hey, you can't do this. And Rorschach says, you're going to have to kill me. So Rorschach takes off his mask so you can finally see he's Walter Kovacs. And then he convinces Dr. Manhattan to kill him. Manhattan keeps it a secret so that the Soviet Union and the United States can finally stop their Cold War, and there's peace on the planet. And he takes off for Mars to form a new life on Europa. I know I'm forgetting a lot of shit. And and then, of course, the coda is that Night Owl 2 and Silk Spectre live a happy domestic life fighting crime, but no kids. Ozymandias lives alone in his fortress of solitude in exile from the world, feeling remorse but justified for what he's done. And the article that was written by Rorschach ends up being picked up in the crank section of the New Statesman, a fringe magazine.
So
and then we're
kind of left
at the end. We're left at the end of the after you've read what is like about 400 pages. We're left with having to kind of figure out the end, what's right and what's wrong, and is it a happy ending or is it an unhappy ending?
Well,
pretty much what's your feeling?
Yeah, Ozymandias' goal is world peace, and he's going to achieve that by fooling the world into thinking that they need to band together to defeat a common enemy. And
all right, so yeah, go ahead.
When the other Watchmen find out about the plan, it's already been done, and Ozymandias convinces them that it was a good plan, so that's why they give up. But Rorschach is not convinced, and Rorschach wants to reveal the plan. But and Ozymandias at that point convinces Dr. Manhattan to kill Rorschach because it saves the plan. And after that happens, I mean, there's a lot of interpretations, but you could interpret it Manhattan just is tired of being manipulated by Ozymandias and being subject to all these ridiculous affairs on Earth that he doesn't care, from people he doesn't care about. He doesn't like the drama. He can't handle the drama anymore. So he just leaves.
It's an interesting ending, right? Because technically speaking, the world is saved, yes? I mean, the cosmic balance of things, 3 million people are dead, but there's now world peace and an end of a nuclear nightmare.
Somewhat ambiguous ending, but yeah, it seems like that world peace has been achieved. And Ozymandias is going to be super rich in the process.
Well, no, Ozymandias actually is not, because he goes off to exile himself.
Yeah, but there's into
an island.
Yes,
there's like an island all.
There are panels in the comic, if I remember right, at the end that show like what's Ozymandias' company's name, but his company is like got logos everywhere. They're making big money everywhere because now that's
true.
Now that there's world peace, is like his companies can really prosper,
But he's not going to enjoy the benefits of that wealth because he's now exiled himself, like the character from the Black, what is it called, the pirate comic that runs throughout the he's like the character in the pirate comic book that runs throughout the comic. Within the comic, he is now exiled into an island all his own. It's quite literally written there that he has to now separate himself from humanity in a way, I guess, to redeem himself or assuage himself from what he's done to humanity. So in that sense, he's like Batman if Batman had a conscience or a need for redemption. But you know what I'm saying? There's a break on him that's pretty damn hard.
I don't know if I'd interpret it that way. I mean, I think.
I can literally read it to you if you want. It's right there. It's on his last lines that he talks about.
Read it.
Okay, I will. Just hold on. I have to get to it. It's really quite lovely. Because there's a scene between him and Dr. Manhattan, and he says to Dr. Manhattan, John, wait. If I did, I wish I'd put my reading glass on. I did these things. I did the right thing, didn't I? All worked out in the end. In the end, nothing, Adrian. Nothing ever ends. Don't. Wait, I want you. And then he just disappears. And we just see this panel, it's the last panel, and he's just there alone. And we understand that he is got no moral, as it had been said earlier, he will neither be condemned or condoned. He's just that last panel of him just standing there alone, his back to the world. It's really quite beautiful.
I interpret it as Ozymandias has a certain degree of hubris to think that he alone can bring world peace, and Manhattan is telling him.
Oh, absolutely.
And Manhattan is telling him, "You're not going to bring world peace. Nothing ever changes." That's why I'm leaving.
Right? Yeah. and it's now. If we could just take a moment on this. So this comes out in '86 and '87, and issue 9, while issue 5 has already hit the stands. So Moore is actually writing the end of the story in reaction to what's going on in the world in 1986 and 87, at least in what's going on in the world in 1986, and also how people are reading into the Watchmen. So while it's true that Thatcherism and Reaganism is running the world, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes leader of the Soviet Union. And by 1986, the United States and the Soviet Union enter into a new form of détente called glasnost, which is a cooling down of tensions. And by 86, we are really working, and I'm 22, I'm a political science major, so I remember this quite vividly, reading the New York Times every day and watching the news. Between glasnost and perestroika, perestroika's 87, there is actually an end of the Cold War that is really going on. And it is really between somebody that Moore really does not like, which we just talked about, Reagan, and yet at the same time, you could argue it's for the greater good. You know, what if he would consider to be one of the most evil presidents, I personally do agree with Moore, but you don't have to, working on a way to end the Cold War with Mikhail Gorbachev. So,
well, I want to say,
in the end, it's the question. The basically what is going on in the world in the writing of the comic book is, yes, without having a giant squid fall on Manhattan, the Cold War is coming to an end.
Well, I just want to say, in that period, a lot of people thought that Ronald Reagan was, and maybe even Ronald Reagan would say, he was increasing tensions between the U.S. and the USSR in an attempt to end the USSR. I mean, Reagan's stated attempt was to destroy the USSR, the evil empire.
But most Sovietologists will tell you, again, I studied the Soviet system, even if that was his claim, the Soviet Union itself was eroding from the inside.
Right. I'm not disputing that. I'm saying
the United States had,
I'm trying to talk about the context of the Watchmen. So I'm trying to add to what you're saying. So a lot of commentators at the time, a lot of people at the time thought, like you said, Reagan is evil. They thought Reagan was evil because he's increasing tensions with the USSR, and perhaps bringing us to the brink of World War III, bringing us into World War III.
I see where you're going with this. Yes,
this was something a lot of people at the time thought, and it wasn't going to happen. Okay, because now in hindsight, we know that the USSR was eventually going to fall anyway.
But you're right. In some sense, you could argue that he's like Ozymandias.
Yeah,
Ronald
maybe.
Reagan.
Yeah, maybe.
Reagan is like, Reagan was not known for being smart, but he was certainly a champion of consumerism. And like Ozymandias, he creates this illusion that by being a warmonger, he was a warmonger, but by at least having Star Wars and escalating tensions with the Soviet Union, with Star Wars, which was space lasers and all the other things, that he was psychologically defeating the rationale for a Cold War. So by being extremely hawkish, he could achieve a very dovish. And this is also the false myth of Nixon, too. Nixon ended the Vietnam War, and he was the one responsible for the original détente between the Soviet Union and the United States and opening the doors to China. So that it takes a mad leader to bring peace. It takes a warmonger to bring peace. So actually, I see what you're saying.
Nixon did something similar, right? Nixon escalated the Vietnam War to a huge extent, and even bombing innocent Cambodia. He escalated the Vietnam War to a huge extent in order to try to end the Vietnam War.
Exactly. And Nixon is the president in The Watchmen in 1985 who ends the Cold War. So Nixon wins the Vietnam War, as he did. Actually, Nixon ends the Vietnam War in real life, but with superheroes, he wins the Vietnam War, and Vietnam becomes the 51st state.
So I guess, So this is a big question, I think, that hangs over the Watchmen as a work is, do you need to understand the Cold War and Vietnam to understand the Watchmen? I don't think you do. But
I think if you do, it helps a lot because remember, it was written in its time to address its time. And in that sense, it's really, to my knowledge, it's the first or one of the first comic books to look at social history and posit an alternative universe where you would see the toxic effects of actual superheroes existing in our society. That's basically, if real superheroes existed, the government and capitalism and industry would absolutely co-opt them, and we would be living in a hellscape of certainly a totalitarian society.
well, I think there's a broader geopolitical theme that the Watchmen touches on is that nuclear weapons, represented by Dr. Manhattan, did create world peace to a large
Yeah,
extent
that's right.
because
That's the mutual assured destruction
right, because
theory.
warfare
Yes.
is now impossible. And, you know, the whole idea of Manhattan going to Vietnam and winning the Vietnam War for America. I mean, Nixon wanted to nuke Vietnam. I mean, he talked about it all the
Yeah.
time.
Bomb them back to the Stone
They
Age.
never did it. They dropped all sorts of ordnance on Vietnam. They dropped more ordnance in Vietnam than I think was ever dropped in World War II, I think is the number.
Yeah.
But they never dropped the nukes. And so the Watchmen almost poses the question, well, would Nixon have won Vietnam if he would have just nuked the whole country?
You know, just as a side note, I don't ever feel like DC really embraced what Moore did unless there's a lovely comic book series where John Byrne, who's really what I always consider more of a Marvel writer, though he did redefine Superman, he writes basically an Elseworld series where Superman and Batman occur in real time, so that they go into business in 38, and they're roughly the same age, and they have children and grandchildren, and they get involved in the Vietnam War, and they play out how the Vietnam War and other things would have been interpreted with superhero involvement. In the only really thing we have with the Vietnam War and real superheroes is in Iron Man. When Iron Man was first written in the 1960s, Iron Man, Tony Stark, built weapons. Look, he ended up being captured by the Vietnamese. That's his origin story. And for the first few years of the comic book, he was still a weapons maker for the US. It's a pretty radical thing Lee did in 68, was it 67, where he had Tony Stark renounce making weapons anymore. Uh, Recently, I think about a year ago, someone did a graphic novel on Spider-Man called Spider-Man: The Life Story. And in it, it was Spider-Man as if he started out originally in 63. And by 66, and it covers each year as a decade, each issue is a decade of his life. But when they get to the Vietnam War, Captain America's been revived and he defects. And Captain America fights for the Vietnamese, who he feels are being unjustly persecuted. And Tony Stark continues to fight for the US. And it's two different superhero groups fighting for the Vietnam War. So this is really Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' legacy, is to really look at how hard, I mean, even if you've read Secret Wars, or if you've read Civil Wars in the comic books, or if you saw Captain America Winter Soldier and you saw how that played, you saw Captain America Winter Soldier, right?
That's right,
Like,
yes.
it really has set to this day, and even in some of the DC stuff, the moral grayishness of what it would be like to have a world with superpowered crime fighters or just ordinary beings as
Well,
vigilante crime fighters.
let me just say, I think one interesting thing about the Watchmen is that Moore asked the question, right? What would happen if you did have these demigods running around and even gods running around? What would the politics of the world end up being? And Moore
Yeah,
says the politics of the world will end up being super right wing because governments could enlist these powerful beings to do their bidding, and no one could resist. I mean, it would be like an ultimate power, you know.
yeah.
So once Dr. Manhattan is on the side of the government, you know, Vietnam has no chance.
Yeah. And at the same time, also in a market-driven economy, and we're seeing it in real life, superheroes, they're a product too. I mean, in fairness, even by that period in history, that was the case. But it's just the way that it reflects upon itself.
Hey, no, could I
Quite
say something?
fascinating.
Could I say
Go
something
ahead.
else that's interesting about this subject? So you take Frank Miller, right? So
Yeah.
Frank Miller, I think, is a famously right-wing author, and his works, his comic book works, are very interesting because he they're good, they're fun, right?
Yeah, and
So
they're not.
he makes
Yeah,
superheroes that are unabashedly, unashamedly right-wing,
but I would
and it
argue
works
that
great.
he's a libertarian, which is a particular kind of right wing. I do believe he's a libertarian. So when you read something like The Dark Knight Returns, and Superman works for the government and Batman doesn't, uh, Miller's no fan of government. He's certainly not a moralist. He just believes that human beings should be free to do what they want to do. There is a libertarian reading, by the way, of even the Watchmen, that it shows you what happens when the government has too much power over our lives. Because aren't the vigilantes who are not registered, aren't they in some way the great libertarian heroes, the John Galts of our society?
Right. Well, one of the things that Alan Moore was obsessed with. I mean, I've read articles, interviews with him. He's always been obsessed with fascism, authoritarianism versus freedom, right?
Yeah,
Individualism. Like V for Vendetta goes into that more.
yeah.
He thinks the real spectrum that we should be worried about isn't right left. It's authoritarianism versus freedom, right?
So since you asked me this question in the beginning, and we're getting around to the end, I want to ask you too. When did you first read The Watchmen, the graphic novels?
I don't know. It was way before the movie came out. It was like maybe 10 years ago.
Well, I mean, it came out in 2000. The movie came out in 2009. So that would have been 1999 that you read it?
Yeah, it might
About
have been
12 years
2000,
after
somewhere in there.
publication. Yes, about 10, 12 years later. And you yourself were in your 20s.
But yeah, the Cold War was over by then.
So were you in college when you read it?
I think I was out of college. I'm not sure though.
So but you were roughly around the same age I was when I read it. You
Po- mm, Probably.
you were a young man in your 20s. Yeah. And you were a young man in your 20s when you read it, just out of college. Had you read a lot of superhero books before then?
Yeah, I mean, well, my background in comic books, I think I've told you before, is me and a friend in high school, he used to love getting indie comics. Like we used to read all the independent comics, mangas, Japanese comics. So I grew up reading a lot of non-superhero comics, just about anything that wasn't a superhero comic. Like, for instance, here's an interesting thing: is like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They were a big alternative indie comic,
Yeah.
like a satire of mainstream
Yeah.
comics when they first came out, and I read it, and then it became like a mainstream comic, and the author
Oh, I
was
used
like
to read
sold out.
it.
That's right.
It was great.
Yeah, the author sold out, and I actually talked to him at a convention one time. And I asked him how he felt about selling
Wow.
out, and his girlfriend, by the way, was gorgeous and taller than him. And I asked him how he felt about selling out, and he said, "I love it. It's the great. It was the greatest decision I ever made."
I hear you. So you never were a fan of Superman or Batman or Green Lantern or
I had a
Green
friend.
Arrow or
I had a
Fantastic
friend that was
Four or
into the
Hulk?
Venom Spider-Man era, and so I read a lot of those. I had another friend that was into the Incredible Hulk during the
Yeah.
weird Incredible Hulk
Oh, right. You're
era,
a big
where
fan of Venom and Carnage, aren't you?
I don't know if I'm a huge fan, but I enjoyed the Venom comics. I also enjoyed there was an era where the Incredible Hulk was they kept putting him in situations where he was the weakest, the weakest strength-wise, the weakest
Yeah.
character in the situation. Like he went to this planet where he was the weakest being on the planet. I mean, they kept putting him in these weird situations, and those
So
were,
what made you decide to read what made you decide to read this?
well,
What made you pick this up?
the era when about 5-10 years after Watchmen came out, it started getting all these accolades. Do you remember? Like,
Yeah, of course.
when it
Yeah.
first came out, people loved it, whatever. But
They
after,
kept on reissuing basically, and I think I picked this up in the 90s, but they kept on pushing out more versions of this with
right,
fancier price tags.
right, yeah. So during the next 10 years, they kept republishing it, and it kept winning all these awards. I think it won like some kind of book award. It was like the first comic book to win some
Time
kind of.
magazine put it in the 100 best English novels from 1923 to the present day. That would have been around the time you picked it up.
Right, right. So it was stuff like that. It made me think, well, this must be good, right? so, I saw all the awards it was winning, so I checked it out, and it was pretty good. I mean,
And after you read it, did it blow your mind, man?
you know what? I think I've told you this before, but yeah, I loved it except for the ending. I didn't like the ending. And then when
Oh,
the
right.
movie came along and the
Okay,
guy
we'll
got rid of
get
the
to that
squid,
next episode.
loved it.
I don't want to talk about it. No. We'll talk about the ending. That's a good place to end. That's a good place to end this particular episode. There is a part 2 coming up where we're going to talk about the movie and the TV series. I thought it was going to be this episode, but no, I think we did enough. All right. Well, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
Thanks for sharing some time with us, and we'll see you in part 2.